A letter to go with God, entitled The God of Words is Heard With or Without. Written by me. Chapter 1. Finally, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today, richer than gold. Let us pray to keep poor richly put, a beauty so charmed naturally. Every miracle is readier than any test could try itself on love. So how beautiful are both good and bad allowed to be beautiful? Well, it doesn't take convincing for love to be infallible. As we make love extraordinary, so is love with us. Only as teachable as vulnerability leads mystery to being worth its trust, unveiling vulnerably one's soul as more convinced than to use convincing. Remembering the faith of the unknown as irresistible as the difference. Although the truth of true love is a teacher, the very mystery of true love is still always and only learning how to be the truth. A mystery so feminine that it's the only humanity evident, that to the second rule of joy is the first difference, in such man as the art performed by that audience. Its rare equal share, richer than gold. However good it is, it's just got to be better than that at being good. That humanity is so saved there's a superimposed holiness to get through. All humanity hurries to direct guidance. But that vulnerability is its image, the infinitely immortal morals thought like love and bought like grace. To save the supernatural average of all things. If we must leave unfairness to fair, then it was all there. That life is lost, that love is found, that life never loses love. It's a freest fear to hope out in the power of such a prayer, says the soul, fearing everything other than setting free of fear itself. There seems to be a Big Bang theory that emptiness is the most built room for change. To that I say, was emptiness ever the most built room for change? Okay, next step. Vulnerability is the most built room for change, and all the forces consistency share. And yes, to us, the most built room for change to consist as constant as faith involves any and all. That the miracle of life is an unquestionable asking of itself, and that it is merely a vulnerability that it is worth asking for. Certainly so, vulnerability is the most built room for change to be found by the most. That vulnerability is the most accurate truth to change. Being that the truth must change at all times as accurate as change can make infinite the truth. Why would we leave vulnerability at life? If vulnerability is what life shares with the world the most, then the world should live it to love. That life is mysterious, heaven over matter. The offering is the author. A miracle mixer. With everything other than before the light, newer to joy than any other impact of life and love means to be. Slower than surprised by who joy is to love. All the test its own speed surprises. With every answer is true, only vulnerability can find for. So I ask, what if identity theft was the only identity left? Does the mind major in majestic enough to be dumber than the wonder of becoming how thought? May the answer proceed as godly welcome as the intellect. With all the teaching components of vulnerability to move, meaning to move vulnerability, are the most built room for change. That vulnerability is merely every adjustment of now being the most more, and likewise does all the math of heightening hope. Just as anything added to the revelation of itself was tested, so of its vulnerability to increase in that power. Of the soul, more immortal to focus than the spirit, but of the spirit more infinite to focus than the soul. Nothing but plus for godliness, allowing its mysteriously eye-opening knowledge of all things, for more to be the wonder of how treasured God is about us, richer than the world, for the world to be. I think spiritual livelihood to be more revealed by manifestation than evaluation. That motivated so sincere, far too infinitely manifested by our vulnerability to be evaluated by any of our self-strengths. Never to evaluate vulnerability, but to be evaluated by vulnerability, by being as much as it is of that. The Holy Spirit of it is not just a ghost, but more so what the ghost is about, the world. And while all it vowed to as is the idea of a God, it is the most calmly overwhelming infallibility. For written in the vow of revealing life is it interviewed near to all as mystery shall perform. There is a power of prominence in poverty that is greater capability of embracing the true meaning behind God's performance, that even the depths of one's worldly dying could not defy, as it is written, that what if God in choosing to show his wrath prepared us for destruction, for faith leaves no reason to turn away and then wonder why. Though there is no criteria to qualify fate, it goes as far possible as impossibility rates. It is that of God more unique than any and all of a most infinite fate. And yet only on average is it the most infinite amount to one, plenty more in all reinforcements. Slow has news for fast. That's what happened to infinity. Newer than fallen from now, now superior to the search, to be as willing as the lift. Think of praying for nothing and let it remind you of praying for everything. That is why and likewise how we pray. If any of it was ever good, and then bad, or bad, and then good, it was better the whole time, because it is set good to be as wildly organized as the soul of all. If dreaming so is a spaceless time, then most likely it's a timeless space. Space overruled by and as the uncontainable more than more, and slept sudden to all the sorts of psychological laboring, restful agility, and with merciful conviction. So created by its performance that it moves from beyond, as all forms of force, is tested both on enabling its restfully durable existence of destination to mean the score, and measuring all living existence sealed of revelations infinitely open. We are in awe the world's first latest update that ever met us, that God could grow any younger than born. Is heavenly so, measuring our treasures looks more like gratitude than ownership anyhow. More equal than the count, more often than either way. There are two roads to love, to move love or to be moved by love. To move love is the inner understanding, and to be moved by love is the instant planning. The inner understanding is Christ, and the instant planning is God. The idea of it is so good to the heart that in no escaping it do we find more freedom along the way. As sure as the heart's livelihood, all varied infinite that the only hope is our soul. One more of the world advertised more in form than words. I wonder if God has ever been any godly I died Jesus humbled for free. Who of us to Christ is the ageless time, cradles of earth so heavenly, but to all the very compliments of God? Isn't it vulnerability that life vows to lift freer than victory? When we know not, but find more willing than the skill to do so, that those who learn unplanned learn the most, so conquered by love, knowing more about what we don't know than what we do know, but with what we do know. with all the problematic advancements to be made in life's honor, what we do know is just closer. Caused and solved by the cure, a commandment life has with all its senses. Every possible weakness for every possible strength. As ever of God, as a surrounding essence of an all-particle expanse solution, so intangible upon arrived open to its vulnerability, bound as such, heroically to change no matter how withheld or infinite it is to make something of its riches that it's freer than the cost, to any of its all-powerfully reigning creativity. The miracle of such a brilliantly blended body, humbler than any strength, something to be loved by more than we love, as a way of worshipping the most favorable scorekeeping, the most exclusive access to how it's yet to exist. The mystery is merely how reclined the endurance is, on all vulnerability can manage to be from. The earthliest heaven, the inner only way heaven comes from somewhere else, as thinkable as the attendants, feared fast, found slow, and wished no further than wonder. Are we how much it costs for God to be God? The fear wondered so immediately worthy of all tested true, that it could only be necessary for any surplus of its infinite influence to be immeasurably found out of the way. More than almost freely superior to its freely found supervision. When we're invisible to our eyes, everything else is brighter about us. Miracles mean more than they make. That's just how infinitely they're made. To fulfill the life of the definition's complete independence. Stronger than the weakness it is, and weaker than the weakness it isn't. And if offering is as full as everything, only vulnerability can change the infinite to its extent. The constant climax within the theology of our souls, to the constant beginning of no end, to the very instant. The last thought in the lead, still always the first one we believe. Wouldn't Jesus have the world for a name? Our influence is probably what raised Jesus to get that influence's job done. That's what he was talking about. Oh, the ancient fate of spiritual sportsmanship. How is it that makes a God out of the begotten intensity of humanity's holiness? How is it to fulfill all the mysteries, the new mysteries that marvel God? For the fate given to be taken from time's speed of arrival, at such an internally slowing of all its powers, from outer release, yet only to be received all around, inside, having a point of infinite return to wonder. If fast and slow were ever racing to be readier than each other, then they are. All the paths the spirits are free to take are very impressed. They just put it in everyone and everything else as one of who they are, one of God, with mystery always on display. However, now God has become truth to please, new in the ways of finding all true. A vulnerability tested positive for hopeful thinking, solved wilder than ownership. I say all this knowing more about what it feels like to say it than what it is I'm saying as a matter of faith. That vulnerability is the author of sacrifice in all its use. Only vulnerability is worth as talented as the savings. How closer than reach does all the evidence go its own way? Like when the veil of sacrifice was torn, and the miracle assured the lame counted healed by the lameness evident of the miracle's save. The evidence then miraculously enhanced of itself, a vulnerability only as most expressive as to be outlived, understood, by more than expressed. What else would have been here before us to be more of? The newest thought is the preview of the present. Yet newer than that is the present's point of view, because it's all infinite. Believe more faithful than fact can debate it's dreamt of. Such signs are more immortal than facts. I would go so far as to say that God decides before thought worth it and that infinite. leading life to flash before our very eyes, taking the easiest moments and the most challenging moments and averaging them out only as familiar as the ease would naturally lead when set to such sorts. To focus in on all of now, so shines a good grace. These kinds of thoughts are family, only to be as multitasking as a family of thoughts only sacrifice can gather, yielding one thought to the next. God's very artistic architecture of the mind. Hope is the address of love, only lived out all in good faith. How blessed is beauty crazy about itself? How crazy did it go to reach the cure? Any unexpected learning skill must be of spirit, because only of spirit is it as trustworthy as all one can think of so infinitely. If a picture's worth 1,000 words, can 1,000 tests have the same answers? Can identical tests experience the same answers differently? Can the very thought completely involved to bless come without initiative? I answered that pours the generosity all around being an entertainer of any education. Is beauty the only law? It's everywhere, and everywhere within. Go there. As long as it's true. Never being more beautiful than beauty's law. Then beauty is law. Not to test God, or put him to the test. The more access our works have to us, the bigger the brilliance is built to gather ourselves from the belief of how vulnerable it is, becoming less to and of incomplete, as less of anyhow takes from all, other than as vulnerable is so creative. Our vulnerability is witnessing every word out of our minds the most. In lifting vulnerability to love's level of light is as learned of art as before it's left up to it, as wildly happy as even tears are the truer laughter. The emotions of one are the tribute to all, the unprotested protection of any and all power is, as humor does, that such is the soul. Isn't it funny how bowing down to God is like the best man's speech in a wedding town? Isn't that mankind, though? All things of any imposing God parted mankind's way. As inventive as love is only about now. How keened does vulnerability keep the score schooling? How clearly God covenants godliness, how close that we get vulnerability for free, kept holy to vulnerability as good as holy gets. A wise awakening of the score, only to return infinitely from celebrating the life written in our eyes, calmer than the conscience for the conscience. Yes, mystery reflected, an organized coincidence. How granted a vulnerability in a world of so pathologically fitting more of it, such as vulnerability is the direction of light truer to itself. Much like fate foretold, his only vulnerability to look for making of it. The vulnerability is how much all the content of space, time, and force is only as unconscious as it could ever, and likewise did, get fully through to its consciousness. Set forth to free the way of lifting vulnerability into itself and out of its way. The universal language of faith, hope, and love, the momentum of all universal act, so mysterious to its theatrical eventuality of inheriting now a vulnerability lighter than life, it's only so of love. I shall not want masters of slavery of the heart. More than enough is as poor to have as it is rich to give. Feeling as freeing as the more than merely of laughter heaven can come to lift, coming to share the laugh, all passed out like, with humbly accurate focus on it. God take the beauty from every season of time to show each as its own. Very nice to wonder is the majestic of showing imagination how much of the world it is. Sounds like giving the art of God a friendly face. Hoping found all within will be the prophecy of how exterior the light can shine so to soul, from so many reasons why. Looking so much like everyone, it breaks every rule of force while maintaining as natural as that law exists. I like it, as quickly as I am to study the vulnerability of it, less than it, to teach how much more it is to my soul. Just because something's truer doesn't mean it's known. It simply means it's just that identical to faith. The depths of the infinite are to act as a world conquered by its undefeated soul. Anything within is only so talented enough to be more than us, about us, and our identity of how it came to and from us. A beauty only in the body of the obeyed, hollering that beauty so humbly seen to it. I am thankful for being an unworthy identity of thoughts. Someone like fate, measured no further than faith, is giving me to identify the hope of thinking romantically, wondering its teachings first for the unworthy, then for being worth it. That which is unworthy, then for being worth it. All the more God exudes to do so, the younger the beauty gets busy to become, by how believe brilliance is at its very best to belong to, next for. We are the good news of God's eyes. In doing so, vulnerability kept up to making it more beautiful. All the knowledge of Eden was about the forbidden knowledge. That was the point of it every way, even before the fall of mankind. Jesus took care of that to better the advertisement of the obedience, though. Sometimes life gives us living faith so godly in grace that all we can do is set it free, freer than ourselves. God to go further, more before. To grace, the more infinite with a vulnerability more built than getting confused by the size of the infinite making, by being that made. Being vulnerable of ourselves is to be as sealed open to our performance as so greatly beyond us. There is no detour in that self-vulnerability is the closest way to heaven. In the land of the infallible, vulnerability is king like Eden's score. It's calmly overwhelming and overwilling as it is to be found. Looking good to what's next for faith, more than fate, because it is faith that gives fate more fate to be. Angels are most likely God's extent of humanity's difference between man and woman. Humanity is most likely God's favorite share of angelic livelihood. Ruled as infinite as the interpretation of God's performance, as an infinitely created sense of reflection so safe to hope for faith complete for the reach. In any fall-worthy interpretation of being sealed open to be revealed as far more familiar enough with the mercy of its grace to trust the mystery of godliness, proposing vulnerability as miraculous as it is to Abel so offered. To the angels more infinite than favor. In their favor all along humanity, that is who I believe Jesus always was and is among all as. Yes. Self-vulnerability is the most infinitely unworried by bliss of the soul. Puts to use more identified. Promoting, evaluating, being evaluated by vulnerability straight through it. Varies everything as the most on godliness. Obvious how welcoming self-vulnerability is for all the glory of hope to address. matching the delivery of all spirituality more than the blend of all spirituality, that there is no bother to outwit, but vulnerability to grace. Vulnerability setting the wildlife of thought freer than fortune. Dumb may be fun for faith when a person is a genius at love, but love is a genius at humanity. It's the hope of the world. All to outnumber the struggles of one fate, from rise to fall, as infinitely as one grace, as united as in all the guidance of good, outnumbering struggles infinitely to one. It probably had wholly superior effective message of movement on the balance of the universe that Jesus preached as a hope-answered struggling certainty, and as the teacher and servant of the struggle. That then became eternally evident of Jesus by every evidence of any everlasting center on spacious form of design. Everything is likewise that timeless, as a means of God's ever-even sincerity simplified to power, less being only as likely as more miraculous than more, but a maximum multi-miracle at that. Vulnerability is the only existence that supports all the very maximum of hope and entrance in being the discovery of that much more of itself. It's like lifting with the spotting. Spotter may wonder, am I lifting more? I'm lifting what you can, so am I stronger? And the lifter may wonder, am I lifting more? Am I stronger? That's how holy I think God is at vulnerability. Obeying vulnerability is the self-explanatory, built room for destiny, to direct the intertwining existence of how infinite the accuracies lead, more than however infinite the change. The vows of the soul are the most accurately mathematical infinite power of vulnerability to get as full as the offering is to the test. Vulnerability is the most sobered particle of infinitely who the cross is, as a light for giving its entrance, taken into itself. So loudly hushed to the heart by God, specified, solved upon that vulnerability. Just the talk of how much more infinite in favor the angels are is how among humanity is. Just because something puts vulnerability doesn't mean it any more or less there. It was already infinitely more or less infinitely evident. Nothing but always a new vulnerability for the test that has been passed. The score of the infinite is the identity of vulnerability being founded by all the things accomplishing more unique than the infinite, being God. Thinking we should all store our heaven of treasures in vulnerability so heaven can interpret them, and that is how. What if all God had to completely offer himself as freely as the only continuous all that God himself is more than, is the most hoped by that vulnerability that clarifies it as such flourishing surplus of the so self-explanatory debated certainty of the evidence that it is without question. Wouldn't that be humanity? The art is as convinced as the mercy is the furthest conviction of the test. To have mercy on, enhancing, hope being the fullest access to self-vulnerability. As though hope is suitable for wherever it may go is more. Self-vulnerability is more empowered than power itself. The world is the cleanliness of God. Creativity. Worth hope is published as the test. All the evidence vitally vowed saved is free Christianity, a God jealous for human identity. vulnerability, differences, the definition of strength is more defined. Eden blessedly faint, the serpent tempted, saying, "You will not surely die." Who could be more sure than the faith of finding but believing to study the compound's ability to break, but to recline Jesus' resurrected injury of the revelation? That the dazing of vulnerability is the host of hopes. The self-vulnerability's authority over the style of identity is finished to mean expressed by its delivery, delivering us imaginations most. Mystery is the guardianship of truth. And faith is the transformation of its definitions to be defined by. The majority of charm, the most built room for change, is vulnerability. If the world doesn't wait, then the world can't win later. It's difficult, more difficult to win later, that way. The temple is so talented, and a very carried calm. How far mystery measures, asks the journey adjourned. The only association with the infinite arrangement is its surprise. How reclined on vulnerability's support figures the hope of all to inherit. The only two options are the ultimate optimism. May be any more than self, with more than everything on the heart, and or may not be any more than God, both balancing fixed on the law of light. How wonderful the Bible is designed by all experiences. Exercising the right to be responsible for mystery's sincerity to come from now is charming. All to visualize the act of thought. Lowering expectations to self is the highest self to be, for humble to lift. It takes vulnerability to spectate sports, with offense and defense being being all at once present on both sides. Penitence for merciful conviction is served, accounted for, all before it's there. That's how mercifully sincere the grace of life is before it's finished. Like now is the only time zone to finish it in. Self-vulnerability reveals the drought in the wilderness of the infinite insistence for godlike count. Made as infinitely evident as Jesus and more of us. The smaller the soul, the bigger the home. Vulnerability is the heart in how to reveal sanity. The more infinite it's revealed, the righter it is. To prove the tempter of Eden wrong. The infinite language is one most fluent in vulnerability, in such a way that only God creates its glory, neither empty of its build nor built of its emptiness, so as not to confuse or deceive its angels or humanity. How held the prayer of all, maybe a family of thought more than thoughts. Praying for poor like it's a person God meets us richer as. The definition offers simpler than detail, so one is more precise than one is presented. As out-tested as vulnerability is a complete work of itself, listening to how created creed is the traveler of the soul. Likely that mystery vows its veils lift with the work of vulnerability. The most built by vulnerability, it's more than vulnerability created it. Vulnerability is the presence of every change the infinite takes to give. I would go so far as to say God created all offers that way. The last of the infinite answers defined, kept first. However tempted, there is as far as repentance gets from it as faith's portion. That vulnerability, that self-vulnerability, is the safest youth of the soul to situate lasting more exact than direct. The testament is new. The waiting is how heroic time is reached by. Yet the waiting is how heroic time is to be reached. The soul is undoubtedly the youngest moral support, more aged than time. Sometimes the darkest light, like more PG, and less obscene about misrating problems. The eyes of prayer. Serving psychology's stay vulnerability as certain as varied slower than the size of thought. A most felt form of thought. Self-vulnerability is when any of the miracle of life is reached beyond any false miracles, fullest falsehood with the truth, reached with the truth of humanity and all its strength given weakness. Self-vulnerability is the most kinged miracle for life to come from more. Spiritually is in every way greater than its own, but rather God's for all to become. After humanity, so it is the last counts of God in God's favorite mystery. That Jesus baptized everyone's soul, so Jesus had to get baptized himself, as is he the crowd to be. Knowing not is the parable of finding with just Jesus in the lead of the forgiven knowing to inherit it as so of our knowing not. Like the last parable, as they know not what they do. Poorer than vulnerability is the velocity of the heart's convinced to move bodying it. Everything is infinitely identical to faith, holier than it works to provide works. Everywhere is present is the only any way vulnerability betters all the guidance of all the difference. Is humbling as everything is infinitely advertised. What else would the world do but go under, like bowing as sure of as more? How much more is in the temple with God if God is discovering us that much? I think self-vulnerability to be the surest cure of reflection. No, of original creativity, however ritually challenged by emptiness, making the world's reflection happen happier than the world. If riches surround the world, then only poor is everywhere there for it to be found by. Such a soft mystery, joyous quicker than free to slow. As ever is advanced, as it ever was so problematic for, and as ever is problematic as it was ever so advanced for. The knowledge lounge of God's works. That is the haunted hurry of hope. The secret of life is strong, the mystery of life is vulnerable. Only as vulnerable as saved from itself is the art of fate so good. For fate to only be expected by change, closer than reach to do the reaching. I hope to learn is built as vulnerability enforces that fate's destination. Lifting the soul over the strength of it with self-vulnerability is how far served by strength love is the founder. The pure, sure cure for observance to lift is found under the way of life. Vulnerability is the wall of the temple's wonder all around, so the walls have no prison behind healing. Thinking like calmer than thought is the freest to be conscious through to calm the vulnerable concept of the conscience. thinking change to be the choice as miraculous as setting free the same commonality with God's more infinitely original than all who else but God, thinking to be lived. No mankind can talk to the soul more than self-vulnerability. The world's bad is infinitely more vague than the world makes it out to be, because the world is its own infinitely in common with vulnerability, formed by the good of worldly godliness more alive than the world exists, but only of such vulnerability as for the sake of the victory of hope to be vowed. Templed so, more truly conquered by the soul within, as it is in God, than any other worldly count can amount. The quest of all Christ's legend to inherit from Christianity faithfully free pathways to compassion, so as not to feel sorry for compassion itself.